at the time, and he and I had one of those conversations about what do you want to do with your life. And he looked at me, he said, you know, Dad, I really enjoy what you do. I like public speaking. And I told him, I said, Will, I'm not going to push you in that direction, but I will certainly mentor you. I will do my best to show you where I've made mistakes, train you a little, share some advice with you. I said, what area of study do you like? He said, I love history. I said, I'll tell you what, you find some type of lesson that will fit what I do, and we'll make it happen. So he went off to study. I ended up giving him 4 or 5 additional books to study. I told him, I said, what I want you to do is I want you to prepare your own lesson, your own PowerPoints. And so this evening, before I present material to you, it is my privilege and pleasure to get to introduce to you my son, Will Harrub.
When I say the words, the Holocaust, to you, what comes to your mind? For many of you, it's probably going to be sadness as you think of the millions of lives that were extinguished. For some of you, it might be a teenage girl named Anne Frank who wrote a diary that detailed the struggles of the Jews that many of you probably had to read in high school. But for most of you, it's going to be a man by the name of Adolf Hitler. Expressions of disgust and anger come across many people's faces as they picture this man who in their minds fueled the Holocaust. But what if I were to tell you that Adolf Hitler was not the man behind the Holocaust? You see, there was a man who founded a theory that became the foundation for Adolf Hitler's belief. This man was raised in England and went on to study theology at Cambridge University. In reality, this was the man behind the slaughtering of millions of people. He's known as the founder of the theory of evolution. His name, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 in Shrewsbury, England, to Robert and Susanna Darwin. Now, his mother died when Charles was only 8 years old, so Charles was predominantly raised by his father, who was a renowned physician like his father before him. It was because of this that Robert desperately wanted Charles to follow in the family footsteps and become a physician. So he sent Charles off to the University of Edinburgh Medical School in Scotland to study to become a physician. Unfortunately for Charles' dad, however, Charles was definitely not meant to be a physician. He couldn't stand the sight of blood. It literally made him sick to his stomach. So his dad realized that there was one profession that could save the family's name, could save the family's reputation, and that was if Charles became a priest. So that's when he packed him up and sent him off to Christ College at Cambridge. Now, it was at Cambridge that Darwin went on to receive his only degree, and that was in theology. Now, how ironic is that this guy, many people they elevate him to the status of one of the greatest scientists of all time, and yet he never even received a degree in science. The only degree that he ever received was in theology. It was also at Cambridge that Darwin befriended a man by the name of John Stephen Henslow, who was a botanist. These two became very good friends, and Henslow realized that Darwin himself was also a very good naturalist. So Henslow recommended that Darwin sail on a ship known as the HMS Beagle with Captain Robert Fitzroy. And this voyage would go on to become one of the most well-known voyages of all time. The voyage began in 1831, and it lasted for 5 years. Before the trip, Darwin was given a copy of a book called Principles of Geology by a man named Charles Lyell. Now, this book proposed that geological structures took millions of years to form. Now, remember that this is contrary to what Darwin had always believed, what he had always been taught. So it was after reading this book that Darwin really began to question the authenticity of the Bible and whether or not God existed. But it wasn't until the Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands that Darwin really began to question the idea of God. At the Galapagos Islands, Darwin observed all kinds of interesting creatures. My dad visited the Galapagos back in 2008, and he told me himself about how exotic and beautiful the plant and animal life there was. Everything from marine iguanas to giant tortoises. But it wasn't these creatures that caught Darwin's attention. It was the finches that really caught Darwin's attention. He studied these finches further, and he went on to discover that there were 13 different kinds of finches at the Galapagos Islands. So Darwin asked himself, he said, why would God create 13 different kinds of finches? Instead, Darwin proposed that they had all originally started from one finch, and all the others had branched out from there. He then went on to propose that this was the case with all creatures in creation. But it wasn't until returning to England that he wrote his famous book in 1859, The Origin of Species. Darwin would then go on to write a second book titled The Descent of Man. And on page 2 of this book, Darwin writes, "The sole object of this work is to console firstly whether man, like every other species, is descended from some pre-existing form, secondly, the manner of his development, and thirdly, the value of the differences between the so-called races of man." Did you catch that phrase there at the end, races of man? You know, that certainly sounds like Darwin was promoting racism. In fact, many people don't know the full title of his first book. Most people just know it as The Origin of Species. That's the full title right there. The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. You see, Darwin truly believed that certain races of man were inferior. He believed that white man was further evolved. It was Darwin's conclusions about the inferiority of certain human races that really influenced his theory of evolution. Now, fast forward roughly 75 years to a man named Adolf Hitler. This man became leader of Germany in the 1930s, and he made it his personal goal to achieve world power for Germany, to make Germany the greatest country on earth, better than everyone else. In fact, he made the quote, "The struggle for world domination will be fought entirely between us, between Germans and Jews. All else is facade and illusion. Behind England stands Israel, and behind France, and behind the United States. Even when we have driven the Jew out of Germany, he remains our world enemy." To gain world dominance, however, Hitler would have to feed his subjects and the citizens of Germany a theory to adopt to excuse all the immoral behavior that he partook in. Darwin did a frighteningly good job of convincing normal, ordinary men like you or me that what he was doing was the right thing. Talking about the extent of the Holocaust, Jerry Bergman writes, "It is estimated that 55 million people died as a result of the Nazis' war on those persons that they regarded as inferior races. Specifically, over 11 million people were murdered directly as part of the Holocaust, including over 5 million Slavic Christians and 6 million Jews. The Nazis murdered close to 2/3 of all Jews then living in Europe, including an estimated 1.1 million children in their quest to create a superior race." Now, while there were many contributing factors that resulted in the Nazi Holocaust, it appears that Darwin-inspired eugenics played a very critical role. Hitler was basically echoing what Darwin was saying in his books when he said that evolutionary progress, it occurs primarily as the result of the elimination of the weak in the struggle for survival. In other words, Hitler believed that the quest to create a superior race was exactly what he was put on the earth to do. In fact, Darwin in his second book, The Descent of Man, wrote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races." Most people don't realize that Hitler was carrying out exactly what Darwin had predicted in his books. You see, the Holocaust should make perfect sense to those who believe in evolution. Because if you truly believe that man has evolved, then trying to create a superior or a perfect race is perfectly reasonable, perfectly acceptable. Darwin's theory of evolution was the main force behind the Holocaust. And because of it, 55 million people were slaughtered in the most cruel and brutal ways the Nazis could think of. Now, let me ask you a question. Is it possible that we have another Holocaust going on in America today? Research shows that 1.2 million babies are being killed in the womb every single year. Out of 100 pregnancies, 22 of them will be abortions. 3,000 abortions happen every single day. And now not only are we satisfied with killing the unborn in our country, we're now killing the elderly. Euthanasia is now legal in 4 states of the Union. You see, we have another Holocaust going on in America today. But this time, it's the unborn and it's the elderly who are the victims. Why is this? Why do we have a society out there who believes it's perfectly acceptable to kill 1.2 million babies every year? I believe the reason for this is because we have a society who has adopted a secular Darwinian worldview. And we've seen exactly what that did to Hitler and the Nazis. You see, it matters what we teach children about their origins. Because what children believe about their origins, what people believe about their origins, it affects their behavior. You see, we must teach them that they were created in the image of God. They didn't evolve from some ape-like creature. They were created in the image of God. If we do this, I believe this will be the first step in stopping this Holocaust going on in America. I'd like to close with the following analogy. Picture in your mind for a moment sitting in a church building just like this on a Sunday morning. There you are, you're listening to scriptures being read, songs sung in praise to God. But midway through one of the songs, you hear the sound of a train going behind the church building. And then something peculiar happens. You notice that the person sitting next to you has begun to sing louder. Before you know it, the whole congregation is singing louder. Louder and louder they get until you can't even hear the sound of the boxcars anymore. The scene that I just mentioned was a very real scenario. This church building was in Nazi Germany around the year 1942 when Hitler was leader of Nazi Germany. There really was a train track behind this particular church building where every Sunday morning, like clockwork, during worship service, boxcars would come rolling down the tracks, filled with the bodies of Jews and disabled human beings on their way to execution. But instead of doing something about this, instead of standing up, getting out of their pews, and trying to save the poor souls who were on their way to death, the members of the church simply sang louder to drown out the sound of the train. Friends, I'm afraid that we as Christians today are singing louder. By that I mean we know of all the problems going on in today's world, but we're simply ignoring them. We're singing louder, and we're hoping that they go away. Well, I'm here this evening telling you that they're not going to go away. Not unless we stand up, get out of our pews, and do something about all the immorality going on around us. Not only do we have to teach our own children about the dangers of Darwinian evolution, but there are 7 billion people out there in the world. You see, we have a great commission that Jesus Christ gave us. If we do this, we teach people the truth about God and about His Word, then we can stop this Holocaust that's going on in America. Thank you.
He mentioned Ordinary Men. There's a book that, with that title, it's kind of a chilling book. It's actually about 12 people who are just like you and I. 12 people, including things like bankers. I think one was an accountant, one was a preacher, one was a baker. These were 12 people who were drafted by Nazi Germany to be a police battalion. Because at that time, all the police were serving in the war. They didn't have enough men to actually serve as police. So they grabbed these 12 ordinary men and they called them into service. What this book does, it actually chronicles the life of these guys as they go from their normal jobs to all of a sudden being asked to execute Jews. The very first time that they were asked to do that, the book talks about how some of them were throwing up so violently they couldn't literally even get a shot off. Other men were shaking so badly that they completely missed their target. But here's the interesting thing. After several months of continued brainwashing, of them being told that the Jews were just useless eaters, of constant indoctrination, these ordinary men became marksmen with an execution neck shot. One bullet right in the back of the head. It just strikes me, I don't think anybody in this room, if I were to say, hey, here's a gun, I want you to go shoot an innocent person, we wouldn't even consider it. And yet, through what they were being taught, little by little, month after month, year after year, they began to embrace this godless idea. I got an email from a young man by the name of Cody. I get emails like this all the time. Cody says, I've been attending the Church of Christ all my life, member since I was 12. I'm 21 now, and I'm really having some problems with doubt. He said, I've talked to you a few times before, but I know I've never just come completely clean and admitted the fact that I'm really having a hard time with this. What do I do? Now, the thing that stands out to me about Cody's email, unlike most of the other ones, is that Cody has actually been through preaching school. He is now a preacher at a congregation, and yet he's struggling with doubt. You see, he went through a system of education that placed seeds of doubt every single year. Like, for instance, this evolutionary theory we're talking about. You open up a textbook where they talk about index fossils. They use trilobites, this fossil that you see there on the screen. They say it's one of the oldest creatures that ever walked on this earth. In fact, if you were to look at it on their time scale, they put it at the very bottom. This would be at the trunk of the evolutionary tree of life. They say this is what everything came from. So you've got trilobites way down here, fish coming into the scene, reptiles, early mammals. Man would be at the very, very top of the screen. The only problem with that is that textbook didn't tell the full picture. You see, when Cody was sitting in that classroom, he got all of this. He got the index fossils and he got the pictures, but he didn't get the story about, for instance, William Meister, who in 1969, he and a couple of his friends were out looking for trilobite fossils. They scaled up a little ledge in Antelope Springs, Utah. They were tapping open rocks. Well, Meister hit one, and it split into two beautiful halves. And he found two trilobites embedded in the sandal print of a human being. Now, folks, think about that for just a moment. Allegedly, these things lived 600 million years ago, and yet you've got a trilobite with a human. How do they explain it? I've actually seen it. I had them take it out of a lockbox in Texas because I'd been told that you can see the sandal, the stitching on the sandal. Folks, there's no getting around it, okay? This is most definitely a sandal print with two trilobites in it. In fact, the man who owns it, he told me, he said, Brad, I've been offered over $1 million by evolutionists who've told him all they want to do is destroy it. You see, the problem is Cody had not been exposed to all the evidence. He'd only been given, or actually he'd only been indoctrinated with what they wanted him to have. Now, let me give you another example. Most of you in here probably very familiar with pictures like this one. The idea that fish came crawling up out of the water onto the land. It's a very, very common staple in the textbooks. This is one of the pillars of evolution. We even have it in our museums. This is at the Fernbank Museum there just outside of Atlanta. Again, you look on their timeline and you'll notice they've got this guy coming in before the dinosaurs. So allegedly this guy is 325 to 410 million years old. And yet, the reality is we know that's not true today. We know that these creatures have been being caught off the coast of Madagascar for decades. The natives there, they actually call them junk fish. And yet, many of you probably went through school where you learned, fish came walking up out of out of the water onto the land. I'll never forget, I had a university student one time. He came down the aisle after I was done speaking at a university, was shaking his finger at me. And he said, "It could have happened." I said, "Whoa, time out. What could have happened?" This young man was very, very upset because I had turned his entire worldview upside down. He looked at me, he said, "The fish, the fish could have crawled out onto the land." And I thought, bless his heart, he's drank all the Kool-Aid. I said, "Do you have just a moment or two that you and I could sit down and talk?" He said, "Yeah, I guess so." So we did. We actually sat down on the front row, and I looked at him. I said, "Here's what I want us to do for just a few minutes. I want you to forget everything you've ever been taught in a textbook, okay? I just want you to use your brain. And let's talk about what would it take for a fish to become a land dweller. I'll give you the respiratory system." I said, "We're going to assume this creature has both gills and lungs. It's physiologically impossible, but I said, I'll give that to you. What else would it need?" And I started rolling. I looked at him, I said, "Very quickly, you're going to have to get lacrimal glands. You're going to have tear ducts. Because that fish's eyes will dry out quickly, not being in an aqueous environment. Not just that, those scales that he's got, you got to get rid of the scales because scales dry out. You need a moisture barrier. You need like sweat glands." And I was having fun. I was rolling. I was talking about digestive system, immune system. You're in a new environment. Here's the funny part. After like 5 minutes, he started joining me. He was adding things to the list. And after 7 minutes, I stopped him and I said, "Do you realize we still haven't named the biggest hurdle that fish has got?" And his eyes got about this big. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, we haven't named the biggest problem he's got. And by this time, we talked about almost all the systems in his body. This guy looks at me and says, "What is it?" I said, "That fish has got to convince his girlfriend to go with him. Because one fish will not get the job done, will it?" You see, the problem is, Cody grew up in an environment where evolution was being taught not as a theory or not even as a possibility, but rather as a what? As a fact. This is a textbook from year 2000. You'll notice the quote says, "Evolution is a fact, not a theory. Birds arose from non-birds, humans from non-humans. No person who pretends any understanding of the natural world can deny these facts any more than he or she can deny that the earth is round, rotates on its axis, and revolves around the sun." Thankfully, this textbook writer got their hand slapped. Because you can't say that evolution is a fact. It's a theory. So imagine what they did. 7 years later, they published a new textbook. And I want you to read with me what they did with their wording. They didn't write that it was a fact. No, what they actually did was they elevated the status of a theory above that of a fact. Take a look right here in the middle. I'll blow it up so you can see it. It says, "Scientific discoveries may be broadly categorized into 4 groups: facts, hypotheses, laws, and theories." Notice this, in order of increasing importance. So we're now going to say that a theory is more important than a fact or a law? Yeah, that's how they get away with it. You see, folks, there's lots and lots of pressure to accept this godless theory. In fact, some of you in this room, you probably grew up at the feet of a man who was teaching you evolution. You didn't even know it. He's used countlessly in younger classrooms, video series. You ever heard of a guy named Bill Nye, the science guy? Oh yeah, very popular. Bill Nye actually came out with a video last year where he basically said this: any parent that would teach their child creation was actually damaging the child, and that creation is not appropriate for children. He goes on in his video to say this. He says, denial of evolution is unique to the United States. Basically, he's wanting to say this. We're the only oddballs out there that still cling to this ancient idea of God. And yet, Bill Nye didn't do his homework. And the reason I would say that is because just a couple of short years earlier, in the journal Science, there was actually a study that was done talking about the public acceptance of evolution. Guess what, folks? United States doesn't hold the record. If you look at the chart, it's actually the nation of Turkey that believes in creation more than we do. And yet, what he's trying to do is to make you think that we're weird, we're odd, we need to give this up because everybody else has bought into it. In fact, he goes on to say this. He says, people still move to the United States, and that's largely because of the intellectual capital we have, the general understanding in science. Now, you guys know there's a lot of discussion these days about immigration, right? You know, I have never met anybody that if you ask them, let's say we take a clipboard down to the Texas-Mexico border, right? And we're interviewing people as they cross the border. And we ask them, are you coming over here for our science? What do you think they're going to say? They're probably going to look at you like you're crazy. In fact, if you were just to Google the question, why do people move to the United States? Anybody think science is in the top 5 answers? No, you get answers like money, freedom, opportunity. And yet here again is this guy who's trying to get across this facade that, hey, we've got to make this change because of our intellectual capital. Well, I would point out, I think they're a lot more worried about their financial capital than they are this alleged intellectual capital. He goes on to say this, when a portion of the population doesn't believe in that, talking about evolution, it holds everybody back. So congratulations, most of you in this room. According to Bill Nye, you're holding people back. Of course, here's my question. I would love to sit down and have coffee with, actually I'd love to debate him toe to toe. But if I could sit down and talk with this man, I would just like to ask him, you're saying this holds everybody back. So what does that mean about people like Sir Isaac Newton? Sir Isaac Newton, without a doubt, one of the greatest scientists of all times. A man who excelled in physics, calculus. This guy was off the charts, founding fields of science. And yet, it was Sir Isaac Newton who wrote papers refuting atheism and defending creation in the Bible. My question? Was he holding us back? In fact, Sir Isaac Newton goes on to say, I find more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than in any profane history whatsoever. Now, it would be one thing if there was only one man in history who was a scientist who believed the Bible. But folks, almost every single scientific field was founded by somebody who believed in God and the Bible. Johann Kepler, founder of the field of astronomy, went to seminary for 2 years. He said astronomy was thinking God's thoughts after him. He goes on to say, I see how God is also gloried by my endeavors in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God. Now, let me point out, that's the founder of the field of astronomy that has now been hijacked by Big Bang theorists who give absolutely no credence to God. You got Blaise Pascal, a man who excelled in hydrostatics, differential calculus, and yet it was Blaise Pascal who came up with that famous wager of how can anyone lose who chooses to be a Christian? He said, let's assume that you're an atheist, I'm a Christian, I live my life a Christian life, you live yours as an atheist, we both die, there is no God. Neither one of us lose. But if you live your life as an atheist, I live mine as a Christian, we both die, and there is a God, you lose everything. His point being, the Christian is never in a losing position. Or maybe we could talk about Robert Boyle, man who is considered to be the father of modern chemistry. Some of you remember Boyle's Law, studied in chemistry. Here's a guy who spent his life devoted to expanding this field. And yet when he died, he actually put part of his estates into what's called the Boyle Lectures. Now, you would assume one of the fathers of modern chemistry, he would have annual lectures about chemistry, right? No, the Boyle Lectures are actually for proving the Christian religion. And yet, here's Bill Nye saying, these men are holding everybody back. Well, I would point out, Bill Nye can't carry their shoes. Because these are men who gave credence to God, and they did amazing science. He goes on to say this. He says, once in a while, I get people that really, or that claim they don't believe in evolution. Kind of like we're three-headed aliens or something. You know, every once in a while, I bump into one of these green Martian-looking creatures. And again, I'm asking myself, where is Bill Nye getting his data from? Because, again, in the journal Science, 2006, they showed only 14% of adults thought that evolution is definitely true. So here you've got Bill Nye saying, you know, every once in a while, I actually still meet somebody who doesn't believe in evolution. And I'm thinking, what foxhole are you living in? Because only 14% of the population actually thinks it's true. He goes on to say this. He says, but don't make your kids do it. That is, don't make your children learn creation because we need them. Now, folks, that ought to send a chill right up your spine. Because that sounds like a whole lot like another guy we just talked about. Adolf Hitler, who said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. You know, we can say a whole lot of bad things about Adolf Hitler, but I'm going to give him credit for one thing. He recognized that children are the ultimate prize. He realized that if he was really going to be this world power, what he needed to do was infect the hearts and the minds of the young people. And my fear is sometimes today, I'm not sure Christians realize our children are the ultimate prize. He ends up finishing his little video with two comments. The first is this. He says, we need people that can, we need engineers that can build stuff and solve problems. In other words, if you believe in creation, you can't do that. You have to believe in evolution to be a good engineer. And again, I'm scratching my head thinking, bless his heart, where's he been living? Because Charles Darwin came up with his theory in 1859. And yet, hopefully I don't have to remind anybody in this room, those Egyptian pyramids have been here a lot longer than that, haven't they? A buddy of mine is a Christian archaeologist. He has been to the pyramids. He's done some dig work over there. He told me, he said, Brad, there is a stone that we know precisely where it was cut from because of the vein of marble. He said they estimate that one stone in the pyramid to be over 60 tons. He said, Brad, it was cut over 200 miles away. How do you get a 60-ton stone through desert, 200 miles, lift it up over your head, and drop it in place at a right angle without any machinery? And yet we know they did that. Now, I do know what the textbooks show. I know textbooks will show men, you know, they've got a bunch of logs and they're rolling these stones. And I'm thinking, you know, Sparky, that's sand. You put 60 tons in sand and it's going to do what? It's going to bog down. And yet, here's Bill Nye saying, we need engineers. Well, maybe we ought to ask them how they did what they did, because we can't do it. He closes by saying this. You know, in another couple of centuries, that worldview, talking about Christianity, I'm sure it just won't exist. Now, that's interesting to me because those similar words were stated by another man by the name of Voltaire, who made the comment. He said, in 100 years, the Bible will not exist. He made that statement well over 100 years ago. Guess what? Voltaire's dead. And guess what they were printing in his house within 100 years? The Bible. You know, here's Bill Nye saying, I exist? Because, folks, that's the only way that people are going to come to embrace his theory. See, there's a lot of things that they're not telling our young people. That they've propped evolution up in such a way that everybody thinks, oh yeah, you know, that's a proven thing. And yet, evolution can't explain how do we get life from non-life. It can't explain the origin of the universe like we talked about last night. Can't explain design. And yet there is a model out there that can. But our kids aren't allowed to talk about it. You know, don't you think it's kind of ironic that we're supposed to be educating our students, but what we're really doing in this area of origins, it's not education, it's indoctrination. Because true education is this. You put the evidence in front of everybody and you say, hey, look, study this, determine for yourself which one you think is true. But instead, what they keep doing is saying, no, we only want to present one, and oh, by the way, you're not even allowed to argue with it. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some of these pillars that they put in front of our kids, like the peppered moths, these are a staple in the textbooks. And basically the story they tell is this. They say, back before the industrial age, that there were 95% of these light-colored, 5% of the dark, because allegedly the birds could see them on the trees, they would eat them. And then the industrial age happened. Coal and soot, ash came on the trees. The buildings became darker, and the population shifted to where now you got 95% dark, 5% light. And they call this evolution in action. Now, the book that I'm showing you on the screen is actually a book that was used around the time I was in high school. Do they still use it today? Oh, yeah. Oh, in fact, we put it in museums today. And you say, Brad, what's the problem? Well, the problem, first off, is those moths don't rest on tree trunks. You say, wait, time out. You just showed us a bunch of pictures of that. Yeah, in over 40 years of research, they've only found a handful, read that, less than 10, actual moths resting on tree trunks. You say, but look at your pictures. Yeah, those are dead. They've either been glued or pinned to the tree. Because think about this for just a moment. Use your brain. When a moth lands, does he land with his wings out? No. His wings are tucked in behind it, right? And yet, in every one of these pictures, the wings are what? They're out. Number two, the moths do not have a tendency to choosing a matching background. In other words, they don't fly around going, well, let's see, I'm a white moth, I need a light colored background. Number three, most important. The guy who did this original research, his name was Kettlewell. Nobody has been able to replicate his findings. Now, you know what we call that in science? We call that rubbish. And yet, are we still using it in textbooks today? Oh, yeah. Why would we do that? Why would we fake something? Well, let me let a textbook writer address that question. We actually asked a guy named Bob Ritter, we said, hey, why are you putting these fake pictures in these textbooks? Look at what he says. You have to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for a first-time learner? He said the advantage of this example of natural selection is that it's extremely visual. He said we want to get across the idea of selective adaptation. Later on, they, talking about high school students, can look at the work critically. Later on, you can discern if it's true or not, but it sells the picture we want it to sell. You're going to swap batteries on. My wife says I have a very large mouth. I'm going to keep talking. So, as Will said previously, one of the things that we've done is we've elevated this guy, Charles Darwin, to the status of a god. You go around, you see statues of him, you see memorials to him. We name streets after him. And one of the little unknowns that nobody is supposed to ever do is we're not supposed to question him. In fact, National Geographic put up a magazine recently titled, Was Darwin Wrong? What do you think? National Geographic. Obviously very pro-Christian magazine, right? I mean, surely they're not going to be biased, right? What do you think their answer was? They say, no, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. So what is some of that evidence they use? Oh, I'm actually going to use the evidence they gave in their magazine. Like, for instance, Haeckel's embryos. Drawn in 1874. So, timeline. You've got Darwin printing his book in 1859. Haeckel comes along and he makes this drawing. Now, just to kind of orient you, if you look lower left, you've got a fish, a salamander, a turtle, chicken, pig, couple of mammals, and a human at 3 different stages of embryonic development. Now, what I want you to really focus on is across that top row, they basically all look the same, don't they? And the reason they look the same is because this man believed Charles Darwin's theory. He said his turning point in his thinking was when he read his book. In fact, those of you who really know your history remember he did visit Charles Darwin there in his home on the Mount. Now, what's the big deal? Big deal is he forged them. He lied. He got kicked out of the University of Jena in the 1800s. So surely we're not still using them, right? Oh yeah, we are. In fact, we've colorized them. We made them a lot prettier. But yeah, they're still in your child's textbooks. In fact, take a look. This is Haeckel's embryos, and below that's the real McCoy. And yet they don't include those pictures in the textbook. Why? Because that doesn't sell the idea that we all evolved from a common ancestor. It's interesting to me, Stephen Jay Gould was commenting on this many years ago in Natural History magazine. Let me remind you, Stephen Jay Gould, very well-known evolutionist, and yet he was rebuking his colleagues. He wrote an article called Atrocious, in which he was talking about the fact we're still using this outdated, bad evidence. Take a look at what he says. We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered the 19th century textbooks. But we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not majority, of modern textbooks. A century of mindless recycling? Yep. Or what about horse evolution? Again, these kinds of pictures, very, very familiar to many of you. The idea that millions of years ago we have this little bitty guy right here who evolves up to a modern day horse. Supposedly, this guy goes by two names, Hyracothrium or Eohippus. And according to evolutionists, he lived about 60 million years ago. Again, he's a staple in the textbooks. I love this one because if you look very carefully, look at what's happening up here at this graph at the top. They've got body size increasing over time. Again, this is why I have a problem with young people not thinking. If that's what evolution does, if body size increases over time, help me understand, why do we have little mice? Or why do we have like small insects? Why aren't humans about 12 feet tall? If everything gets bigger over time, then why do we have little anything? And yet the reality is we know all of this is made up for the textbooks. Harrub Nielsen, who is an evolutionist, he said this: the family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in the textbooks. He said, in the reality provided by the results of research, it is put together from three parts, of which only the last can be described as including horses. Folks, he said that all the way back in 1954, and yet in 2016, we're still putting it in the textbooks. George Gaylord Simpson, he summed it up this way. He said, the uniform, continuous transformation of Hyracothrium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generation of textbook writers, never happened in nature. He's right. Or what about another evolutionary icon that most people in this room are very familiar with? 2 weeks ago, I was teaching in Oklahoma. We had a question and answer session, and sure enough, about a 15, 16-year-old young man, he raised his hand and he asked this question. He said, but what about vestigial structures? You see, he had learned about these in his textbook, and he was assuming that this was proof for evolution. Yeah, they're in the textbooks. In fact, take a look at this sentence. It says, vestigial structures are remnants of an organism's evolutionary past. Now, I realize some of you in this room over the age of 50, you're scratching your head going, what's a vestigial structure? A vestigial structure is allegedly a leftover byproduct that we don't need from your evolutionary ancestors. Like, for instance, they would say your tonsils, your appendix, all of these supposedly are vestigial structures. The year 1931, scientists claimed that humans had 180 vestigial organs in the body. That number has gone down to 0 today. Because we know that, yes, we know that all of these parts have a function. But that doesn't stop them from adding vestigial structures along with their arguments for proof of evolution. In fact, I love this page. You've got Haeckel's embryos on one side, you've got vestigial structures, both of which are total lies, totally fabricated. In fact, let me show you a progression that I hope you will remember. If we go back to 1989, some of you remember those years, some of you more than others. 1989, they were still teaching in the textbooks this idea about vestigial structures, pointing to, for instance, the appendix. You fast forward to 1994. This is from a Glencoe biology textbook. They had a picture of the human appendix right beside that of a horse, with the idea that ours is just kind of shriveled up into this little worm-like structure right here. That was 1994. Still teaching that it's vestigial. 1998, Growler's Encyclopedia finally broke open the door. And they admitted, they said, long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. Its removal also increases a person's susceptibility to leukemia, to Hodgkin's disease, cancer of the colon, and cancer of the ovaries. Oh, wait, you mean it had a function? Yeah. In fact, isn't it interesting? 20, 30 years ago, if they were anywhere in your abdomen doing surgery, you know what they automatically removed? They took out your appendix just because they were in the neighborhood. They don't do that anymore. When I was little, you get strep throat 3 or 4 times in a row. Guess what they automatically did? They took out your tonsils. They're not as quick to do that anymore. You know why? Because we now know that's the #1 immune defense of your pharynx. And yet, just because we didn't know something back then, we made an assumption this doesn't have a function. It's not needed. I love the way R.L.Y. song, he summed it up this way. He said, not too long ago, man was imputed to have 180 vestiges. Organs like the appendix, the tonsils, the thymus, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, they were all on the list. He said today, all former vestigial organs are known to have some function during the life of the individual. He says if the organ has any function at any time, it cannot be called rudimentary or vestigial. As a man's knowledge has increased, the list of vestigial organs decreased. He said, so what really was vestigial? Was it not man's rudimentary knowledge of the intricacies of the body? He's basically saying, look, just because we don't know what something does, doesn't mean that it's a vestigial organ. Let's look at one more evolutionary hoax. Again, this is a pillar in the textbooks. It's one of their icons. It's used routinely to say, hey, that evolution is true. And in fact, in that National Geographic where they're saying there's overwhelming evidence, they use the Archaeopteryx. Big funny looking word, basically all you need to remember, this is allegedly the creature that links dinosaurs to birds. Now, lest there be any parent in this room that think your child is not going to be indoctrinated, let me point out to you, they're teaching them even on kids' meal bags these days. By the way, look at the box right here at the bottom. I love this. Huge red letters. It says fact. Then below that it says new findings show that birds are probably related to dinosaurs. Scientists in China have discovered 2 fossils of feathered dinosaurs. Okay, wait a second, reread that. Fact. New findings show that birds are probably related to dinosaurs. Yeah, but that's a fact. It's interesting to me. You go to the St. Louis Zoo today, there's a place called the Living World section where they have a shrine to Charles Darwin. And you'll notice as you look around here, you've got pictures of his finches, but right over here you've got a picture of this creature we're talking about, the Archaeopteryx. Basically, they found a fossil of a bird that's got teeth. And lo and behold, we know most birds today, they don't have teeth, right? So imagine, if you will, for just a moment, you are coming at everything from a godless perspective. You have to be able to explain everything through evolution. Now, you don't mind explaining fish because you look at that and you say, yeah, there was water, fish evolved. And then you realize, okay, we got to get on to land, so maybe some of them fish like walked out, like used their fins and made a cow. By the way, have you ever thought about this? Supposedly, according to evolutionary theory, fish evolved out onto the land. They became, for instance, a cow. And then after millions of years, some of those cows decided, you know what, I want to go back. And they evolved a blowhole and became aquatic mammals. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But here was their problem. They hadn't described birds. Where did birds come from? And how do you evolve flight? By the way, let me point out to you, you don't just have flight in one creature, do you? If evolution is true, you got to explain flight in insects, mammals, that would be bats, birds, flying reptiles. We could throw in flying fish for fun. Now, other question, do all insects fly the same? Oh no. You think about a bumblebee and a dragonfly. And so they had this problem. How do we explain this? They decide that maybe the birds evolved from dinosaurs, even though we know that's not what happened. For instance, new research shows birds lack the embryonic thumb dinosaurs had, suggesting it's almost impossible for the species to be closely related. Furthermore, I think everybody in here knows dinosaurs have scales. What do birds have? Feathers. Anybody in here ever seen a skether? No. Colin Patterson, one of the senior paleontologists, British Museum of Natural History, talking about the Archaeopteryx, he said it's simply become a patsy for wishful thinking. He said, is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. He says there's no way of answering the question. It's easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, to find reasons why the stages should be favored for natural selection. But he says, but such stories are not a part of science, for there is no way of putting them to the test. Alan Fiducia, probably one of the world's foremost ornithologists, he says, I conclude that Archaeopteryx was arboreal, volant, considerably advanced aerodynamically, probably capable of flapping powered flight to at least some degree. He said Archaeopteryx was, in the modern sense, a bird. Now, he made that declaration in 1993. Fast forward more than a decade. Lots of papers coming out saying, hey, this guy is the missing link. Textbooks pronouncing Archaeopteryx as a missing link. I decided I wanted to write to Dr. Fiducia to make sure I wasn't mischaracterizing him, because here you got the world's experts saying this thing's only a bird. So I did. I emailed him. So, Dr. Fiducia, I send you warm greetings from Nashville. Are you now of the position that Archaeopteryx was not a bird? He writes back. He says, Archaeopteryx was clearly a well-developed bird with true feathers. He goes on to tell me it would never be anything but a bird. I'm not surprised, because National Geographic had tried this 5 years earlier. 5 years earlier, they had introduced another missing link. By the way, any young people in this room, if you ever get the chance to do a research paper, dig up this issue of National Geographic's November 1999 and do your paper on a creature called Archaeoraptor. Oh, you're going to have fun with this guy. Archaeoraptor. So here's the issue in the magazine. Notice what the subtitle is. Title is Feather for T-Rex. New bird-like fossils are missing links in dinosaur evolution. This is it. It's in this particular issue. They announced the arrival of this guy right here, Archaeoraptor. And oh man, he looks cool. They showed a picture of his fossil. The only problem is, the only place where this guy evolved was in a Chinese farmhouse. Because here's what happened. Some Chinese farmers found fossils from a dinosaur and fossils from a bird. They took the back half of the dinosaur, cement pasted it together with that of the bird. They did it well enough, by the way, that they didn't actually detect it until after they'd given it a scientific name, after they put it in National Geographic. The way they decided, they actually found out, they ran it through an MRI. Look at what Lewis Simmons says. He says, the only problem is that these farmers realize fossil fanciers prefer specimens assembled and suitable for display. Therefore, on occasion, the farmers will doctor the fossils to follow basic market economics, thus increase the value of their finds. He says Archaeoraptor actually evolved in a Chinese farmhouse where homemade paste was used to glue together two completely different fossils. And yet this is their overwhelming evidence. You see, folks, when you really stop and boil it down, you realize there's not a whole lot holding up evolution other than the concept of everybody believes it. I was in New Zealand one time, and a young man, he was arguing with me. And he made that statement. He says, everybody believes this. And I did something I don't know that I've ever done since then. We were during the Q&A session, and I literally just handed him the microphone. And I said, would you please share with us just one example, and tell us how it actually works? Now, those of you who have ever listened to a public speaker, you know that silence, when you're up here speaking, if you go 5 seconds, that's a long time to be quiet, right? 10 seconds is really, really long. This guy, I kid you not, we're like 35 seconds in, he hadn't said a word. And it was starting to get uncomfortable, and I was happy to let him hang himself. I just thought, you know. So again, I looked at him, I said, just one, that's all we need is one example. Finally, he bust out, he said, fruit flies. I said, fruit flies what? He said, fruit flies. We have blind fruit flies. I said, okay, let me get this straight. So you have a researcher who designed an experiment to mate fruit flies with other fruit flies to give you what? And the rest of the group said, fruit flies. I said, buddy, that's the best you got? And it was. He never named another example. I then begged him, I said, could you tell me how evolution works? You know what he said? Natural selection. I said, natural selection was actually brought about by a creationist, Edward Blythe. I said, I don't have a problem with you saying it weeds out the sick. It explains the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. Right? Natural selection won't get you there. What else? Then he starts throwing out things like, well, time. I said, buddy, time's working against you. Because according to science, as things progress in time, they go towards disorder, chaos. Leave your car in your front yard 50 years if you don't believe me. I said, you got to go from a single-cell amoeba to a human. And you're saying time can do that? Folks, time and chance are just words we use. They don't actually manipulate anything. Then he finally throws out, well, mutations did it. I said, could you tell me how many beneficial mutations we have? And I looked at him and I made him a deal that I've made it several different places. I said, if you can give me 12 beneficial mutations, I'll give you $1,000 right now. You know the highest number I've ever been given? 5. And I'm talking on college campuses. All I've ever been given is 5. And that's giving them sickle cell anemia being a positive thing for malaria. Folks, they can't give me 5. I said, how many positive mutations do you think you'd need to go from being a fish to a land dweller? Those mutations would become the rule instead of the exception. I said, most mutations are negative. You've got a few that are neutral. You have a very scant few that are beneficial. And yet what you're calling for, you would need miraculous beneficial mutations. He looked at me. Here was his literal last words. As he's handing me the microphone, he says, well, but everybody believes it. And I looked at him and I said, not everybody. I hope and I pray that as you evaluate the evidence, you realize, folks, there's a lot more truth in God's Word than there is those textbooks. We're going to take about a 8-minute break, let you get up, stretch your legs. Again, I appreciate your patience, your attention. We will start back in just a few minutes. Thank you.